There is a particular kind of feeling that arrives quietly, often without warning, and almost always uninvited. It appears when a colleague receives the promotion you had been quietly hoping for. It surfaces when a friend announces something good, a new relationship, a new opportunity, a new version of the life you had imagined for yourself. On the outside, you smile. You say the right things. You may even mean them, at least partially. But underneath, something else is moving. A small, uncomfortable shift. A weight that wasn't there a moment ago. It doesn't announce itself as envy. It rarely does. Instead, it arrives disguised as something more acceptable, a sudden critical thought about the other person, a quiet questioning of whether they really deserved it, a vague sense that something about the situation isn't quite fair. The mind is quick to find a more respectable name for what it's feeling. But the feeling itself is older than the name, and more honest. What makes envy particularly difficult is that it so often begins as something innocent. Admiration. You notice someone who has something, a quality, a status, a life, and something in you responds to it. That response, at first, is not unpleasant. It can even feel like inspiration. Like a signal pointing toward what you want. But at some point, without a clear moment of transition, the feeling changes. The admiration remains, but something heavier settles beneath it. The other person's good fortune stops feeling like a possibility and starts feeling like a contrast. And contrast, when it cuts close enough, has a way of becoming painful. This is the part that is rarely spoken about honestly. Not the envy itself, but the specific discomfort of feeling it toward someone you genuinely care about. A sibling. A close friend. Someone whose success you know you are supposed to celebrate, and perhaps part of you does. But another part is quietly keeping score, measuring the distance between where they are and where you are, and finding the gap harder to look at than you expected. The feeling doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a person. Envy is not a sign of weakness or moral failure. It is a signal, one of the oldest in human experience, that something inside you has been touched. Something that matters. The question is not whether the feeling is there. It almost certainly is. The question is what it is actually pointing to, and why it arrived wearing someone else's face. There is a concept in the psychology of Carl Jung that offers a surprisingly precise description of what happens in the moment envy arrives. Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds everything we have pushed out of conscious view. Not because those things are evil, but because they are uncomfortable. Because they contradict the version of ourselves we prefer to present, to others and to ourselves. The shadow doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It simply moves beneath the surface and finds other ways to speak. Envy is one of those ways. When you feel that quiet, uncomfortable weight at someone else's good news, Jung would suggest you are not simply reacting to them. You are reacting to something in yourself that their success has brought too close to the surface. Something you want but haven't allowed yourself to fully acknowledge wanting. Something you once hoped for, perhaps quietly buried under more practical considerations, or more acceptable ambitions. The other person hasn't caused the feeling. They have simply reflected it back at you, the way a mirror reflects what is already there. This is what Jung meant by projection. The emotion that feels directed outward, toward the other person, toward the unfairness of the situation, is in many cases an inward emotion that has been redirected. It is easier to feel quietly critical of someone else's success than to sit with the recognition that you want something you don't yet have. The mind, Jung observed, is extraordinarily skilled at protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. And one of its most reliable strategies is to locate the discomfort somewhere outside. What makes this particularly worth sitting with is that the shadow, in Jung's understanding, is not purely negative. It is simply unintegrated. The envy you feel towards someone who creates, leads, or lives differently than you is often pointing directly at something in you that has not yet been given space. A desire that hasn't been named. A capability that hasn't been tested. A version of yourself that exists in the shadow because looking at it directly feels too exposing, or too uncertain, or too far from where you currently are. Jung's insight is not that envy is secretly a virtue. It is that envy, like most shadow emotions, carries information. It surfaces at the edges of what we most want and least admit. And if you are willing to look at it honestly, without flinching away too quickly, it will often tell you something true, not about the person you are envying, but about yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche had a word for something he observed with uncomfortable precision in human behavior. He called it ressentiment, a French term he used deliberately, because he felt it captured something the ordinary word resentment did not quite reach. Ressentiment is not simply anger or disappointment. It is something more layered. It is what happens when a painful feeling, one born from a sense of inferiority or powerlessness, cannot be expressed directly, and so it turns inward, ferments quietly, and eventually resurfaces as a moral story. This is where envy becomes particularly interesting under Nietzsche's lens. Because envy, left unexamined, rarely stays as envy. It transforms. The feeling that began as a painful awareness of someone else's advantage gradually rewrites itself into something that feels far more dignified. The person you envy is recast in your mind. Their success becomes suspect. Their character becomes questionable. Their good fortune becomes evidence of something unfair, something unearned, something that says more about luck or circumstance or the corruption of the system than it does about genuine merit. And in that reframing, the envy quietly disappears, replaced by what now feels like a reasonable, even principled, critique. Nietzsche saw this movement clearly and described it without mercy. The story we tell, he argued, is almost never about what we claim it is about. When envy disguises itself as moral judgment, it feels righteous. It feels like clarity. It feels like you are simply calling something out that others are too polite or too naive to see. But underneath the judgment, Nietzsche would observe, the original feeling is still there, unchanged, unresolved, simply wearing a more acceptable coat. What makes this so difficult to see in yourself is that the moral story always feels genuinely true when you are inside it. The critical thought about the other person does not feel like a defense mechanism. It feels like an honest observation. The sense of unfairness does not feel like displaced pain. It feels like legitimate grievance. Nietzsche's point is not that these thoughts are always wrong. It is that when they arrive immediately on the heels of someone else's success, their timing is worth questioning. Envy that becomes judgment is envy that has found a way to feel comfortable with itself. And comfort, in this particular case, is precisely what prevents the feeling from being understood. Because as long as the story holds, there is no reason to look at what the story was built to hide. René Girard noticed something that is easy to overlook precisely because it is so constant. We do not simply want things because we want them. We want things, Girard argued, because others want them. Desire is not as original or as personal as we tend to believe. It is imitative. We observe another person, someone close enough to compare ourselves to, and their desire quietly becomes the signal that tells us what is worth wanting. Their reach toward something makes that thing visible, and visibility makes it valuable. This is the mechanism Girard called mimetic desire, and it runs beneath an enormous amount of what we experience as personal ambition, personal taste, and personal longing. It also runs beneath envy. Because if desire is imitative, then the person you envy is not simply someone who has something you want. They are, in a very precise sense, the person whose desire showed you that you wanted it. They modeled the object before you consciously registered the wanting. Which means the feeling directed at them is tangled up with something that came from them in the first place. Girard observed that this dynamic, when it intensifies, becomes deeply unstable. The closer two people are in status, the more their desires mirror each other, and the more charged the space between them becomes. Envy flourishes precisely where the distance is smallest. Niccolò Machiavelli, observing human behavior from an entirely different position, was not interested in the interior life or the origins of desire. He was interested in what people actually do. And what he observed, with the cool precision he was known for, is that envy inside a hierarchy is rarely passive. It finds outlets. It shapes who gets supported and who gets quietly undermined. It influences which information is shared and which is withheld. It reorganises alliances in ways that are almost never acknowledged openly, because to acknowledge them would be to admit the feeling driving them. In Machiavelli's world, envy does not stay as a feeling. It becomes behavior. It becomes positioning. And it does so quietly enough that it can always be explained as something else. Together, Girard and Machiavelli describe the same force from two different directions. One traces where the wanting comes from. The other traces where it goes. But what both observations share is a quiet and unsettling implication, that envy, by the time it becomes visible in behavior, has already been working for some time. It has already shaped what you reach for, what you withhold, and how you position yourself in relation to the people closest to you. It operates, as most social forces do, just below the threshold of what we are willing to examine. And that, perhaps, is precisely what gives it so much room to move.